In this video, I'm going to show you how I overcame 15 years of video game addiction by ironically using video games themselves. Hi, and welcome back to Mental Health Power. So, video game addiction may seem like a strange topic to bring up because it may be compared to something like one of the previous videos I did on mobile phone addiction. And yes, they do share some similarities, absolutely. But video games, because they are in and of themselves a unique form of media, where they essentially are combining multiple different forms of media into one, and they have a unique interactive aspect that pretty much no other form of media has, as well as, no other form of entertainment has. This means that not only are video games themselves unique as media and entertainment, but any problems related to them will also present unique differences as well. And so that means, of course, that an addiction to video games is also going to be a little bit different and in some ways very specific to video games. So how can we tell what video game addiction actually is? So based on my own experiences, you could on one level just say that video game addiction is just the inability to stop playing video games. And yes, that's largely true, but that's oversimplifying it because there are multiple layers to this. So yes, on one hand, it's when you find it very difficult to stop playing video games. Specifically, this video is focused on not just games in general, but it's more related to what we would call console games, so PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo consoles, and PC as well, and also the handheld consoles as well, and Mac. It does also apply to mobile games as well, but because I haven't really played many mobile games, then my experiences won't be based off mobile games as much, but I do mention why even mobile game addiction is quite unique, even within video game addiction as well. And so when you do have video game addiction, or if you suspect you might have it, or someone you know might have it, you may notice that you feel the urge to play games. And there's a difference, it's quite subtle. And I only noticed this when I stopped being addicted, which is there's a difference between an actual inner urge to play and a simple feeling of wanting to experience the game. I know that's a little abstract, but this is the difference. Usually the urge will come if, let's say, you've experienced stress of some kind, or you start to experience boredom and you can't, for any reason, actually sit with the experience of the stress or of the boredom or other feelings that can come as well. And so if the urge becomes overwhelming, and if you notice that you find yourself trying to change things in your life to accommodate for the urge to play games, if you notice that you try to get things out of the way and things that appear in your life appear to be barriers or obstacles to playing games, then you may have to consider if there is a problem there, because we don't need video games, which I know is a bit controversial coming from me, someone who played video games for 26 years. But we don't need them, okay? But if we have that urge, then it means a part of us feels that we actually need to play it. And what happens if we can't play video games? So if this urge comes and for whatever reason something gets in the way of us playing games, when you have this kind of addiction, you feel bad when you're not able to play. So when you're not able to actually get, let's say you're not able to play a particular amount, let's say you're only able to play 5-10 minutes, you can still end up feeling bad just because you weren't able to play. You can even end up feeling angry as if something was taken away from you. That's when you also have to consider maybe there might be a problem there. And when you are playing games, if you notice, as I did, that actually you start to feel normal, or you start to feel good emotions, or even relieved after playing the games, then you have to question, why don't I feel that way without playing games? And of course, these are difficult questions. It was very challenging for me to come to these conclusions about myself, but it's only when we understand not just why we can become addicted to video games, as in the underlying reasons behind it, but we also have to look at video games themselves to understand why they are unique in terms of addiction. Because the difference between, let's say, one of the previous videos I did on mobile phone addiction is it's not necessarily just the dopamine, as in the pleasure chemical, the reward chemical being released in our brain that comes from video games. Yes, that's an aspect of it, definitely. Video games are unique because, unlike any other form of media, they are the most immersive, generally speaking. Of course, it might be argued with maybe, I don't mean something like virtual reality, because that's still effectively a video game, but the more immersive version. God knows what's going to happen when we have virtual reality game addiction. That's another thing entirely. But video games, generally speaking, are often, it does depend on the type of video games because there are so many genres. They tend to be essentially immersive simulations. So typical thing is, if you're watching a movie, yes, you can feel somewhat connected to who you're seeing on the screen, the characters, the actors, the actresses, etc., the environment of the movies. But it's nowhere near, absolutely nowhere near as immersive as video games are, because you are the one controlling the character or characters, so you have actual agency in the game. And because you can move around, you can look wherever you want, obviously it does depend on the type of game. This means that the brain doesn't necessarily fully differentiate it between reality and the fantasy. Obviously, to a certain degree, yes. But the reason why I say that is because there is a big difference between the emotions that are generated and the level of focus that comes from playing games and watching a movie, or let's say reading a book. There is a very different level of immersion that you get, to the point where I don't actually find horror movies scary because I got used to playing horror video games, and they just don't compare in terms of how immersed you can get and how scary they can be. The same with action movies and, let's say, games that have a high amount of action. The effect on your body is very different from a movie because, yes, on the one hand, maybe your heart pumps a little bit watching an action movie. If you're playing a game where you are the one having to survive in, let's say, let's just use a typical example, like you're fighting monsters or, an army or something. It's quite different when it's you doing it, because part of you, to a certain degree, believes it's true, which is why you will have your body reacting, your heart beating, you'll feel certain tension in your body because part of us believes it's real, which is the entire reason why we watch movies and enjoy entertainment in the first place, because there is a certain amount of immersion that we get, and that's what's obviously entertaining. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. Video games are amazing for that, but it's a problem in a sense that makes it even more ripe for those who could get addicted to it, and we'll come into reasons as to why that is. And obviously video games are designed to be engaging, so on the one hand, of course, if you have a form of entertainment, you are going to want people to engage with it. So you want, if you have a movie, you want people to watch it all the way through. If you have a video game, you want people to play it all the way through. The difference, however, is that engagement is needed far more for video games, because it's rare for video games to be 2 or 3 hours long like movies. You're more likely to get a game that's at a minimum. As an example, a game that's considered very short is 5 hours. 5 hours is considered to be really, really short for a game. Even 10 hours to an extent. You'll often get games that are 50 hours, 100 hours, more than 100 hours. Some games are technically endless. If you're playing them online, they just keep going and going, and they keep adding more content. This, you can see, makes it inherently more likely to become addictive. And yes, so on one hand, there is that dopamine spike. On the other hand, video games, because they are so immersive, they in many ways can meet emotional and psychological needs to a certain extent. Obviously, it will never replace the real thing in real life. So I'll give you an example. Positives. Video games are very, very good for stress relief, depending on the types of games you play. Because when we play them, we are either taking out anger, or some games are very calm, and you can find ways to relax with them. Games where you can build things, for example. The negative, of course, is that if someone has had a difficult life, or they've had very long amounts of stress or traumatic experiences, or a difficult upbringing, and their emotional, psychological needs were not met, or specific ones, you can imagine then that since the mind is designed to protect us and for our survival, if it finds something that meets an unmet need, even if it's not the real thing, there is a good chance that it will continue to look for it if we don't find a real way to meet that need. So one thing you can do is, if you do think you're having a problem with stopping playing video games, try and look at the types of games you prefer to play. I noticed this pattern in me. So when I was knee-deep in lots of mental health issues, I noticed I had a massive preference for what we would call open world games. So these games essentially present you as a character, or different characters, and you have a massive world that is big enough and detailed enough, with other characters that are essentially living their own lives, that it becomes almost like you're living another life in another world to a certain degree, because of the sheer amount of things you can do and the freedom you have. So I noticed I had a preference for games that essentially were power fantasies or freedom fantasies, where you had all of these things you could do. And so because I was so knee deep in psychological, emotional, mental health issues, it met the need, which was to feel that way, because I didn't have that. Of course, this meant that I would easily become addicted. I also noticed, although I wouldn't say I became addicted to these types of games, I noticed I had a big preference for horror games for a long period of time. And so I wondered, could it be because on some deeper level I could relate to it in my real life experiences? Because if you think about horror games, at the, let's say, core level, you're playing a character who is essentially constantly running away from a predator or predator type entities of some kind. That's if I distill horror games down to an absolute basic. And often you don't really have a way to fight back, and that's what makes them scary. Sometimes in some of these games, all you can do is run and hide. And I couldn't help but notice parallels to my experiences of mental health, where at the time I didn't understand most of what was going on with the mental health issues. So I was always essentially trying to survive day by day and avoiding all of these issues, which I noticed was very similar, metaphorically speaking, in a kind of artistic way, to the kind of horror games I was playing. And so I thought, could that have also been a type of power fantasy where I was essentially living out what I wanted to achieve, which was escaping from these shadows and these invisible forces that I couldn't properly understand at the time? So there are positives to video games because they can teach us a lot. They can meet needs in a positive way, as long as they don't completely replace the real life aspect of that positive emotion. So some games, for example, have a massive social element. So you can go online and play games, meet people. I've made friends through games. Some I've met in real life eventually. A lot of my friends we met because we enjoyed games, but we would meet in real life. But if these experiences which games give become a complete replacement for the real thing, or if this is the only way that you can get that emotional or psychological needs met, then I would say that's a problem. Because what happens when you can't get the games? And so this is where the problems lie. So of course, I remember the day I realized I had a problem. I think I must have been about 16, 17, maybe 16. Yeah, I think I was about maybe even 15. God, I was playing a lot of World of Warcraft. That game is designed to be really addictive. I know all their tricks, but it's still a good game. At one point I realized, I looked at the time, I'm like, okay, it's midday. I'm going to play World of Warcraft just for an hour. Of course, it didn't happen. The time just vanished in a second. I looked and I realized, oh my God, the sun's gone, it's sunset. And I looked and it was 7 p.m. and I didn't even notice the time go by. I'm sure people who play games at some point may have had this kind of experience. But at that point I realized, you know what, I might have a problem, but I was too young to really fully comprehend it. So it took many, many other years for me to really realize it was a problem. And so it is a massive waste of time when it comes to a problem, because, it's not like I'm watching a 2-hour movie or a 10-hour box set of a TV show. I might be playing a game that's hundreds of hours long, or I could be playing a game online, which essentially like how sports work, you just keep playing multiple matches over and over again. This, of course, there is a dopamine aspect where it creates instant gratification. And so on one level, yes, it is meeting certain needs, like maybe the social need. Maybe it's also meeting the need for a feeling of control. So let's say you like lots of strategy games, management games, maybe that's meeting a need for a sense of control that maybe you may not have in your life. Or maybe you look at the kind of games you play, but you also may notice that ultimately they all give us instant gratification. Well, most games on some level do. Because of the way games are designed, you'll have a challenge, you'll have a challenge and a reward to get from that challenge. So when we receive the rewards in the game, although they're not real, of course, in our minds, we still perceive them as a reward. And so you can imagine, let's say, even the very original some of the old games like Super Mario Brothers on the original Nintendo in the mid to late 80s, coins were used as a reward because we inherently have been conditioned to see, obviously, money as a reward, which makes perfect sense. Or you have more modern games like Candy Crush, they use sweets, right? Because psychologically we see that as a reward. But other times rewards can be other things, like you get new items, you unlock new things, you get more access to other things. And the rewards can build on top of each other. So, you get a set of rewards, then you can use that to buy something else in the game. And you get a minor sense of gratification compared to the real life rewards you would get from actually spending time to create something. And the rewards you get take much, much, much longer, but they last. But they are lasting rewards compared to obviously the instant gratification. And obviously video games aren't the only ones guilty of this. Social media, different kind of apps, mobile phones, food, drink, all kinds of things, they will also give instant gratification. The other thing that makes video games unique in terms of the problems it can create if you do have an addiction, or the beginning of an addiction, is it can massively affect sleep. So there's a difference between, let's say, falling asleep with the TV on, or just watching a movie then going to sleep. Yes, your brain will be stimulated to a point, and it may become more difficult to fall asleep. But video games can be on a completely different level depending on the type of games you're playing. Because the difference is, with video games, you are using just so much more of your brain. So with movies, movies are passive. There's no interactivity. At best, you can comment on what's going on or talk to people about it while you're watching. The only interactivity you have is, pausing, rewinding, and forwarding it, or skipping an episode, which is not, I wouldn't count that as real interactivity. Interactivity, because it's a part of video games, you are automatically going to be making different decisions. So you are making decisions constantly, which is going to use different parts of our brain. So an extreme example would be if you're playing, let's say, a first-person shooter game. Your brain will be constantly making second-by-second split decisions. Like, okay, there are 10 enemies, I need to shoot these people. Or let's say it's a game where you're having to quickly manage resources before something destroys your base, for example. Again, I'm using very generic examples. You will have to very, very quickly, second by second, make decisions as to what you're doing. Or in some games where, let's say you're flying, you're going to be using your brain's spatial awareness parts as well. Or let's say there are puzzle games. Again, you're thinking or problem solving on a much deeper level. And these are just a few examples. There are so many ways that games will use multiple different aspects of your brain at the same time. So using multiple ways of problem solving. Often there are games like Minecraft where you're creating things as well. So that's a whole other aspect of your brain being used. So imagine you're doing that for hours and this is massively stimulating your brain, and then you want to go and try to sleep. It's going to make it very, very difficult. So one of the things I had to do was just stop playing games an hour before bed, or to avoid using technology, but especially video games, because then you try to sleep and your brain is still going with it going on in your head. You can feel your brain being overstimulated. And so yeah, it can affect sleep, and of course if your sleep is affected, then other things get affected, and there's a knock-on effect, because if your sleep is affected, you don't feel good. If you don't feel good, you maybe have problems in your daily life. You're not focusing as much, not concentrating as much. Because you feel bad, and you'll probably end up playing video games to make you feel better. So you can see how a never-ending downward spiral can develop from that. But one of the unique things about video games, this is something I only really realized within the last few months. So the fear of failure is something that probably we'll all experience at some point, but the chronic fear of failure is a real issue which I had, and to be honest, I'm still learning about to overcome. But the connection between video games is pretty unique, because if you are somebody who has played loads of video games and is the main form of entertainment that you have, or one of your main forms of entertainment, something interesting can happen, because often we can end up making it part of our actual identity. And when that happens, that presents its own unique set of issues sometimes. Because video games, ultimately, most video games you want are about winning, right? About overcoming obstacles, about problem solving. I mean, I'm very much summarizing what video games are on a fundamental level about. But this means that, in a way, and I've seen other people have also experienced this, I and other people are essentially conditioning ourselves to not fail, which presents an interesting problem, because then in real life failure is normal. It's a part of the road to success, right? Nobody who's learning something at the beginning is going to just automatically learn and do it like that. But with video games, there aren't any real consequences when you fail. In real life, there can be, even if they're minor. And so what I noticed was I used to struggle to try new things, and I used to struggle to actually just accept failing or making mistakes, or the potential to make mistakes. And I realized after looking into it that video game addiction was a part of that, because I noticed that if let's say I was playing online, so when I was like 16, 17, I used to play a lot of Counter-Strike, which is a very, very highly competitive online game. I just could not, I used to absolutely hate it when I used to lose, and it would really, really frustrate me. And I realized looking back, that is not a proportionate reaction to what's actually going on. And I noticed that this also meant that there were many things later on in life I found difficult to try, because I realized being addicted to video games meant it was much, much harder to fail. Because if my identity was attached to video games, or at least a large aspect of it, then being good at video games had a very, very high level of importance. So then if there was the possibility of failing something, in my mind, I associated it to not just, oh, okay, I just made a mistake, or oh, I failed at this thing. It became something about my actual self-image, about me personally. And so this was something that was very, very subtle and hard to recognize. And, it did go away eventually. It stopped being such a big issue, but I did notice how even later on in life I noticed how, it was difficult for me to try new things or to do things because I could fail. And I noticed that it's highly probable there was a connection between video game addiction and the fear of failure from in trying new things. And so now that I've explained why I experienced the video game addiction and why it's a quite unique form of addiction, I'm going to show you now how I overcame this and how, yes, I used video games to overcome video game addiction, but also how I was uniquely equipped to overcome video game addiction. And this is largely because I studied video game design and development at university. And so on the one hand, while I did have let's say I had an identity where video games and being good at them and knowing lots about them was part of the identity, which I can see led me to study video games, as in video game development. So on the one hand, it did in a way make me go almost deeper into the addiction to a certain extent. I also then learned how video games worked, which not only gave me an understanding of why they were addictive for me personally, and probably for others as well, it also gave me the tools in resolving the problem. And so I'm going to show you exactly how that is.